And he cracked that bottle open while we were dining, and it was one of those aha, Eureka moments. And right there, I knew I wanted to explore how that wine came to be. And that started the journey to a very great degree, that bottle.
Wine is, for lack of a better word, intimidating. When you're standing in front of 100 bottles trying to decipher which one won't make the dinner party disappointed or break the bank, it can be hard to make sense of it all. But it doesn't have to be this way. What if I told you that bold red wines, think Shiraz, think Cabernets, all the old favourites, aren't just for collectors and sommeliers, but for almost anyone? I'm Nick Hall, Editor-in-Chief of Van & Many, and welcome to our new series where we sit down with creators, makers, and disruptors to decode the things in life that we love. Now today, I'm joined by a very special guest who knows infinitely more about wine than I do, Chris Carpenter. Chris is the chief winemaker at Hickinbotham Wines and Vineyard, a stunning high-elevation vineyard in South Australia. But that's just one side of him. Chris is also a jazz musician, a biochemist, and one of the few people on earth who makes an elite Cabernet both in Napa Valley and Australia. If you ever wanted to learn about bold reds, you couldn't ask for a better guide. Chris, welcome to the podcast. So great to have you here.
Good to be here, Nick. Thank you.
No worries. Now, let's start at the beginning. For people who don't know you yet, how would you describe what you do?
How do I describe what I do? Well, I farm vineyards to create really good grapes that will help me create really good wine. And I oversee the fermentations of any number of different wines, both in Napa Valley and in McLaren Vale, to create a wine that will transport you to that place and that time where I'm making it.
Now, you've had a pretty fascinating pathway into winemaking, obviously starting with hospitality and then going through science and music as well. Was there a specific wine or grape that brought you to the vineyard in the first place?
Yeah, so I was working as a bartender in Chicago many years ago, and a lot of my friends were in the restaurant industry, and one of them worked at a little Italian place in an area of Chicago called Little Italy. And this is a place that had, the red and white checker top tablecloths. Yeah, classic. You'd go in there, there'd be one table filled with cops, another table filled with mafioso, another table with yuppies, and a table with restaurant people. And one of the guys that worked there was a pal of ours, and he was about probably 3 or 4 years ahead of the wine learning spectrum than the rest of us. And we had been going in there for years drinking basket wines, Chianti and with the basket around it. And one night he's like, you guys are far too much into the restaurant industry not to appreciate good wine. I brought a bottle that I wanted to share with you. And it was a bottle of the 1990 Groth Reserve Cabernet Sauvignon. And he cracked that bottle open while we were dining. And it was one of those aha, Eureka moments. And right there, I knew I wanted to explore how that wine came to be. And that started the journey to a very great degree, that bottle.
It's so interesting that you started with a Cabernet Sauvignon, because I would rate that as something that people usually build up to.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it. I mean, frankly, the Chianti was probably more of that pathway, but that wine then transformed me to the next level, and who would have thought that was in that particular vintage was an incredible vintage in Napa. That particular wine, unbeknownst to those of us that were dining that night, had been rated exceptionally well. And he was presenting this wine to us out of a favor just to kind of make that transformation happen with this group of friends that he had. And it did, at least for me, and I'm sure for many others at the table.
So you have that kind of transformational moment where you know that this is something you want to do. Where do you go next? How do you start that journey of getting into winemaking?
Well, so I had that moment, right? And I was not only working in the restaurants in Chicago, but I was also working during the day for a medical products company. And I was selling blood and urine analyzers to hospital labs. And I didn't wake up in the morning and go, blood and urine analyzers, let's go. And some people do, and God love them. But that wasn't for me. And I sold a great product. I worked for a great company. But I love the restaurant industry. I wanted to get back into applied science, which I had studied as an undergraduate in my college years, biology particularly, and I wanted to do something creative. And I didn't know how to put it all together, but I knew I had to figure it out because I had to make a decision for the organization that I worked for during the day. So I took a walkabout. I went out to California. Took 3 weeks, made my way from San Diego up to the Bay Area, and one of the last visits was in Napa Valley, and I put it all together. Like, here's an industry that is intimately connected with the restaurants, which I wanted to stay connected to, that you use any number of different fields within the sciences on a daily basis, and has a certain portion of its work centered around creativity. And yeah, so that, making that realization there, and then coming back to Chicago, I was fortunate. I had subscriptions to food and wine magazines, and in one of those magazines, there was an article about a gentleman who had studied at University of California at Davis to get his degree in winemaking. And I read that, and I knew that was my path.
That's so funny. And now we look at it, you're kind of splitting your time between Napa Valley and McLaren Vale.
Yeah.
How do you find that balance? Do you bring lessons from one region to the other?
All the time. That's the wonderful thing about the wine industry in general around the world. It's a very sharing industry. There are new techniques, there are new ways of approaching challenges in vineyards. To think about winemaking as a holistic endeavor, and I can tell you exactly how I do things in Napa Valley, and you could take that back to South Australia, and you're not going to make the same wines, because a lot of what winemaking is driven by, the differences are these geographies that we're working in. So that part of it allows for sharing without having to worry that you're giving up any particular secrets, right? So I've learned a tremendous amount from my colleagues in South Australia. I've learned a lot about aspects of the grapes there that I've been able to then take back to Napa Valley, and I hope vice versa. With the vineyard that we took over in 2012, the Hickinbotham Vineyard, a lot of what I brought to the table was an understanding of how to grow Cabernet at a very high level.
Yeah, one thing that obviously is the similarity between the two regions is this idea of bold red wines.
Yes.
So what do we mean when we talk about bold red wines?
I think when we use that as a descriptor, we're talking about wines that have depth, that have a textural component to the wine, not just, one of the great things about wine is that there's a tactile experience. And there's a lighter, fresher wine style that might be like a Pinot Grigio. And then there's a wine that has undercurrents and weight and a texture along your palate and a resonance after you've swallowed it. That's usually what we're referring to with bold wines. And Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot and Shiraz fall into that general category.
Characteristically, are there things that you like more in a bold red wine as opposed to other things? Yeah,
well, that's a great question. And so that you had mentioned at the beginning, how do you decipher any one part of this matrix that wine is? And a lot of it has to do with, what do you personally like? Right. And you need to, as an individual, you need to figure that out. For me, with Cabernet, there's a couple of things. Cabernet has that structural component, that chewiness, that length, meaning you've swallowed it and it just keeps going on and on and on because it's so concentrated that it's evaporating on your palate over time. It's got complexity. So it's multi-layered. Again, you think about a Pinot Grigio. Pinot Grigio is a pretty simple wine. It's a delicious wine, but it doesn't have as many different layers as a Cabernet Sauvignon or a Shiraz might have. So being able to pinpoint those layers and lose yourself in the complexity, much like you would lose yourself in the complexity of a Mozart concert or
like that.
That there's layers that you're being turned on by. And my wines, I like to have that in there. I want people to experience my wines on many different levels, emotionally, gastronomically, tactily, and it's all there for you.
People need to find what turns them on, what they like about certain wines. If you're a new wine drinker, something that you haven't experienced before, how do you find that? Where do you start?
Well, that's an excellent question. Where I would start, and what I've recommended to a lot of people, is find a really good bottle shop near you. And go in there and find somebody who, describe a wine that you want. Do you, and maybe it's that and this is how I started. maybe you're pairing it with a dinner that night. So listen, I'm going to have lamb tonight. I want something that can stand up to the lamb, but that's not going to overwhelm it, that is lighter on the palate, but still something that will carry through the meal. And most of those guys that work in bottle shops can then, direct you to that. And then you can start learning about it, and you can start learning what goes best with other things. And then you start individualizing each one of those wines across a spectrum of that particular variety. There's 10 different ways that I can make Shiraz. And there's no reason that any one of them is better than the other than that moment and what you're looking for. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you called out, obviously, heading to the bottle shop. I feel like the level of wine education in bottle shops in Australia has dramatically increased in the past, 10, 15 years. Feels like you can get some real excellent insights from people at the local shop.
You should be. I mean, most of the people that are working there, if they're in that field, have some knowledge, or they have the ability to increase their knowledge, because there are wine reps, there are winemakers, there are people coming in there and tasting them all the time. So they're able to direct you, just like the place in Chicago when I was just starting to learn about wine. I didn't know enough about it. And I had like 3 different guys that would help me it was a place called Sam's. And I learned that one of the guys really dialed in my palate well. And that was the guy who I knew what days he worked. When I would need to buy wine, I'd go in when he worked. And he helped me those first couple of years gain the first part of the knowledge base that I needed ultimately to move on to my own exploration.
It's a great point to raise, because I feel like one of the big misconceptions when it comes to wine, much like whiskey, is that age statements and the older is better, but that's not always the case.
That's not always the case. No, it's just, it comes down to personal preference. It comes down to, what you're trying to accomplish with that bottle of wine. I mean, if it's a night of celebration, you're going to get a bottle of champagne, because it's going to make everybody happy. Champagne always makes people happy. But it may not be the best time to have a Cabernet that night, but maybe you're having a big old piece of steak later that night. Sure. So you're going to get a Cab. Those kind of decisions happen all the time in wine. And one of the great things about wine is there are so many choices that you can make, and you can go any different direction. And oftentimes it's going to work just because.
Speaking of the different choices, can you run me through the different core red varietals and what separates, a Shiraz from a Cab Sav?
Well, what separates a Cab from a Shiraz is there's a couple different things that break that apart. So Cabernet tends to have a tremendous amount of tannin. Tannin are these compounds that when you taste a wine, it may be the drying effect that you feel or the chewiness of wine. If you've ever had a really good Cab and you kind of go, wow, I could chew on that. That's tannin. Shiraz doesn't have that same level of tannin. Shiraz has a great middle body, typically. So when you have a Shiraz, that the weight of that palate will be much greater, all else being relative to the production methodologies between the two wines. There's a spiciness to Shiraz, like almost like a bell pepper, black pepper spice that Cabernet has a little bit of, but not like Shiraz.
Not to the same extent.
No, and then there's also often with Shiraz a savoriness to it, whereas Cab has this bright, dark fruit character typically, and those things they're equal in their presentation relative to one another, but so distant. And why in this country, in Australia, the two were blended together for many years and still are. We make a wine that's a Cab Shiraz blend because they can stand up to one another, but they fit like puzzle pieces together. So it's kind of like The Rock and Kevin Hart, complete opposite, but together they're hilarious,
So here in Australia, obviously we have a very rich wine culture. What is it about Australian wine? What defines Australian wine in your eyes?
I don't think there's a vast difference in the quality of the vineyards. I think some of the highest quality vineyards in the world are in Australia. I think some of the most passionate winemakers and most developed research arm of the wine industry happens in Australia. And there's similarities in other regions to that. There's a a very proud tradition of some unique wines. You think about the Rutherford Glen Moscato or Hunter Valley Semillon or the Cab Shiraz blend or sparkling Shiraz.
Yeah, exactly.
Those are Australian as you can get, man. And those are things that the Aussie industry is very proud of because they're a unique contribution to the overall industry. So, to separate it out, you have to look at the regions and how different regions define themselves per that variety versus other regions. So with Cabernet, which I'm involved in the U.S., you think about Napa Valley, Walla Walla, Paso Robles as Cabernet areas. In France, Bordeaux generally. Here in Australia, Margaret River, the Yarra, and Clarendon, McLaren Vale, where I operate out of, those are cab regions, and they're all presenting cab at a very high level, but just different. Because it's a different region, it's different geography, and all the factors that make up that geography are unique, which make it really cool as a wine drinker because you can go through that exploration without ever having to leave your dinner table.
That's so true. Let's zoom in a little bit on Clarendon for now. What is it about that slice of South Australia that is so unique?
Yeah, so Clarendon sits at the northern side of the McLaren Vale. And most of the McLaren Vale is protected by the Mount Lofty Ranges and protected to the extent that the breezes and the cooling effect coming off the Gulf of St. Vincent don't hit that part of McLaren Vale. And where you can grow incredible Grenache because it's really warm. Where McLaren Vale has mostly put its flag up around a variety, it's around Grenache because of that area. You start heading up towards the Adelaide Hills at the far northern part of the Vale, and you hit Clarendon, which is at elevation, which is above that protection and gets all that cooling effect and gets it early in the afternoon, cooling down the vineyard, giving it an opportunity. Cabernet doesn't do so well in really hot areas. It needs a little bit of a cool down. And up in Clarendon, you get that, and you've got these soils that have a unique character that add a unique character to the wine. They're very different than the rest of the Vale. And then you're closer to the sun. You're at 1,100 feet, and you're getting more radiative energy, and you're getting more of it for longer because you're above the fog line when there's fog. So you combine all those things, and Cabernet flourishes in those kind of environments, and that's why I'm there, because I want to work with those kind of vineyards.
So when you are there, obviously there's a lot going on, but walk me through the Hickinbotham process and taking it from vine to bottle.
So we farm organically. We are one step away from a regenerative accreditation because we're using a lot of the techniques around regenerative farming. We farm with precision. We farm for wine. We're not farming for grapes. So all the decisions that we make in the vineyard are based on creating gold, right? You can take gold and turn it into jewelry. You can't take lead and turn it into gold.
That's true.
Right? So we farm for gold. And that being said, what will happen is when the grapes will then express that place. And I want to make wines that speak to the place. I'm not making Napa Valley wines in McLaren Vale. So farming that way brings it through the process. And when it gets into the winery, we try to keep that make side of it as simple as possible. Because if we start using a lot of the new technologies that are out there, and there's plenty of them, or we're overt in our technique, it becomes more about winemaking. And I wanted to speak to Clarendon. So we do native yeast fermentations, meaning the yeast that grow up in the vineyard are what carry out the fermentation versus buying yeast from a lab. And there's plenty of great yeasts out there and plenty of people that do that. This is a style decision. We're very mechanical in the winery. We're looking at flavor as it builds over time, making the decisions based on how that fermentation is happening. We basket press, and then we put down to French oak barrels that'll reside in that oak for anywhere up to 14 to 16 months, depending on the vintage.
It's so interesting because you talked at the start just then about regenerative, which I feel like is a very progressive approach. But then at the same time, going back to some very traditional elements of basket pressing and things like that. How do you balance those two ideologies?
Well, when you think about it, regenerative is very old school as well. It's just been forgotten.
Right.
And bringing, having sheep in the vineyard to mow down your weeds, that was used 1,000 years ago and then just lost vogue because it costs money and it's not as efficient, but it's actually a much better way to handle the natural world partnership than trying to ram technology into the natural world. So what we do in the winery is reflective of what we've done in the vineyard, and all those things combine to have the holistic approach to everything that we're talking about with winemaking is really important. I think we're moving forward, but we're also paying homage to a natural setting in both environments,
which I feel like is very fitting with winemaking.
Generally, it should be, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Because you're dealing with you're dealing with yeast, you're dealing with plants, and you're creating something that's just a natural outcome of the interaction of a plant reproductive body with a fungal organism that wants to use those resources, and out of it comes this product that mammals like to consume. So everybody's happy.
I was going to ask you, but I feel like you answered it just in the way that you spoke then. But do you like the science side of it?
Oh, I love the science side of it. Yeah, I geek out on it. It's one of, I geek out on everything about wine. I geek out on the science side. I geek out on the spiritual side. I geek out on the dining and convivial side. It's the great thing about wine is that there's so many different pieces of my personal interest that I combine with this field that I'm never bored. There's always something new to learn.
But all that geeking out obviously isn't for nothing. There is kind of 5 key wines that you guys work on. Can you run me through the main product lines that you've got at the moment?
Yeah, so Hickinbotham has a number of different wines. We make a Merlot, a Cab Franc, a Shiraz, a Cabernet Sauvignon, and a Cab Shiraz blend called the Peak. And each one is meant to highlight not only the varietal character, but again, the geographic character of Clarendon. And they're all developed in this vineyard that is ideal for each one of those varieties. And got a lot of luck with that.
Cab Franc is the one that is catching everyone's eye in the office, I think.
Oh, good.
It's one that we don't see that often.
No. So Cab Franc is a variety that is one of the 5 basic varieties in Bordeaux. Bordeaux either combines or utilizes individual expressions of Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Malbec, Petit Verdot, and Cabernet Franc. Cabernet Franc has been immortalized by one of the brands on the right bank of Bordeaux called Cheval Blanc. And this is a wine that's highly collectible, one of the great wines of France. We planted Cabernet Franc at Hickinbotham because we initially intended to make it a blending wine. So use it as like a spice rack wine in Cabernet or something. What we found was that it was so bloody good that we should make a wine that speaks to this vineyard, speaks to the variety unto itself. And it is very reminiscent of right bank Cabernet Franc. It's got a lot of great floral notes like rose petal and orange blossom. It's got this great red fruit character, and it's got an energy to it that is just outstanding. Now, that said, it's presented in a right bank style, which is more, a little more savory, a little more weighty, more usually brought to a little higher ripeness. There's another area of France called the Loire. And in the Loire, there's Cab Franc as well. And those Cab Francs tend to have a lot more bell pepper character, a lot more like base cherry characters. They're lower alcohol. They're what we would call crunchy wines. And a lot of those wines are produced here in Australia in the Adelaide Hills, but they're very distinct. They're nothing like our wine. And where they're grown in the Adelaide Hills, it's appropriate for them to be made in that form versus the ones that we're making in Clarendon.
And those places, obviously, regions are so integral to the way that a finished product comes out. I'm talking obviously earlier about whiskey and things like that. Do you find there's a lot of crossover between whiskey drinkers and red wine in terms of what they're after?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I'm making 2 different whiskeys back in California.
Oh, you're kidding?
Yeah, from bourbon that we've sourced in Kentucky. And a lot of why we're making those whiskeys is because our audience likes that complexity, likes that depth. And what's interesting further is that the complexity of each is such that you can dive into them and learn and get lost in that discovery.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Do you see with people who may be going back to the whiskey drinkers trying red wine if they haven't before, do you see people making mistakes when they get into wine for the first time?
Oh, sure. Everybody does. I mean, I did. I mean, and you shouldn't be worried about that. There's, again, what you should keep thinking about when you're getting into wine is, do I like it? And who cares what anybody else thinks? If I like this wine, and it makes you happy, then go with it. And whiskey is much the same way, right? I mean, you can think about whiskey's, let's say, cask strength versus 94 proof. They're very different. Or a 7-year versus a 12-year. Some people they might go for the 12-year only because it's a 12-year, but It may not be as good as a 7-year for a cocktail. So I make the 2 whiskeys I make back in the States. One is it's an 8-year, and the other is a combined, because I blend a few different ages together, a 12-year. And that 12-year has a lot more rye in it. And so bottled at cask strength. So this is a whiskey that you want to have a big old of ice, in that glass. And you want to watch that evolution as that ice is melting around the whiskey. Whereas the other whiskey I made for that market, that Maker's Mark and Woodford and some of the more blended and cocktail use whiskeys are for. And that, the same thing happens with wine. My wines that I make in California, one of them I make for the collectors. It's a wine that has big tannins, great grip. It's got concentration out the wazoo, and it'll last in your cellar for 25 years. But in a restaurant environment, that's not an ideal wine, because they open up a young wine, it may swamp the food that's being served. So I make a wine that's a little bit more approachable, doesn't have the tannins, doesn't have the weight, and it's a little bit more connected to a restaurant environment. And I'm very explicit about that when I'm out there talking about it, because I want everybody to experience my ideas. And sometimes, you can't wait for 25 years. Here's a wine that you can open up that night.
That's funny. The other crossover that we see often with whiskey and wine is obviously price point as well.
Yes. So
with you guys, can you tell 100% that there's a major difference between a $90 bottle of wine and a $20 bottle of wine?
Typically, yeah. We're pricing wines based on not only the amount of attention to detail that we're utilizing to farm those grapes, to make the wine, but the quality level. And that quality level is, you can tell a $5 bottle of Yellowtail versus a $200 bottle of Henschke. There's a vast separation, and it's based on the concentration and the color and the complexity and the structure. They're all those factors come into play.
So for someone who's looking to dip their toe into the premium world wine, what advice do you have for them?
Well, I mentioned, find a good bottle shop that you can learn from. Go online. There's plenty of places online that can teach you about wine, and you're jumping into that, right? The man of many wants to help your readers learn about that. I'm sure you'll continue to develop places where your readers can learn, and there are plenty of places out there to do that. And just drink wine. Don't order a beer don't order a cocktail, order some wine and get the som at the restaurant to tell you why you should order that. I mean, that's always fun. I did that last night. I was at a little Italian place, Ragazzi, if you haven't eaten there. It's outstanding. And I was chatting with the sommelier behind or he was actually the bartender behind the bar about a couple of the wines that he had that I wasn't familiar with. And he was teaching me because this particular variety I didn't know about. And don't be afraid. I mean, wine people, part of the problem is, and you've said it in a couple different ways here, is wine can be intimidating because there's so much information out there. And there's a whole category of people that all they do is study it. Well, God love them for studying it. But one of the things that they do when they study it is they love to share that information. So don't be afraid. And you're never going to make a fool of yourself by asking questions, no matter what you're talking about. And with wine, you need to always ask questions because there's always something to learn. I've been doing it now for 30 some odd years. I'm still asking questions. I'm still learning. And that's the great thing about wine.
Amazing. Now, I only have a few more questions for you. And one of them is, it's always subjective, but how do you think people should enjoy wine? Is there a specific soundtrack? You're a musician. You should. Yeah. Surely there's some sort of jazz track that works best for a Hickinbotham.
Well, I mean, I go anywhere from Aerosmith to John Coltrane to Beethoven when I'm drinking wine. It just depends what mood I'm in. Okay. You know,
I wouldn't have picked Cab Sav as an Aerosmith wine, but maybe it is.
Dream on, baby. Are you kidding me?
Now, last question is any upcoming tastings, events, or special releases that people should know about with Hickinbotham?
Well, we've released the 22s recently, and those are doing really well, and they're singing. I just tasted with a wine writer an hour or so ago, and the 22s are just on fire. And we're going to taste after, right? So the 22s are really, it's a wonderful vintage with a lot of energy. You know, we have an event coming up. I won't be here. The assistant winemaker for Hickinbotham will be there, Guillaume Camagard with Myra Station in South Australia. That's coming up in the next month or so. That'll be a wonderful event. You know, I don't know if you know anything about Myra Station. They're a beef producer in South Australia that finishes their cattle the last month of their life on lollies and chocolate.
Oh, I love that.
It's unbelievable, this beef. So that's the next thing coming up.
I love it. Chris, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights. Hickinbotham Clarendon Vineyards' amazing collection of reds is available pretty much all good bottle shops around the country. So get involved, elevate your drinking experience, and as always, drink responsibly. In the meantime, don't forget to follow Man of Many wherever you get your podcasts. Sign up for our newsletter and make sure you follow us on social media for all the latest in products, culture, and style. I've been Nick Hall. Stay safe, team. Thank you so much, Chris.